I think as big tech loses its monopoly on information, particularly I'm talking about Twitter no longer being held by the hands of liberals, but perhaps maybe a more free thinking billionaire named Elon Musk, I think the calls for censorship are going to get more intense from the left. And I think the Canadian government's going to be happy to oblige. But in the meantime, the leaks coming out of Twitter are telling us some pretty, frankly, unsurprising things. I don't think that there's anything that I've seen in the Twitter leaks that have actually surprised me. It's just interesting to see them confirmed in action. And one of the memes that was on Twitter for the longest time was sort of that everything I don't like is Russian misinformation. And it sounds as though that was an official policy at Twitter. So, joining me now to discuss the latest installment of the Twitter leaks is our friend Ian Miles Chong. He's a journalist here at Rebel News, and he's also a bit of a Twitter friend with Elon Musk himself. Ian, please tell us, what is the latest installment of the Twitter files? What's the most important information that was dumped in all of that? Because, for the longest time, like I said, if you said something that sort of cut against the narrative of the liberal mainstream media, you were a Russian agent. But that actually seemed to be the censorship policy down at Twitter.
Absolutely. And that is the subject of this, the latest two Twitter files drops. So according to, and this is not something that Twitter came up with at first. This is actually the a result of pressure from the US State Department and a number of other agencies. They were building off the narrative, the Russia disinformation hoax, the Russia collusion hoax, I should say, the one that claimed Trump was installed by Putin himself. They were building off of that. And Twitter, in fact, could not find any evidence of Russian bots or Russian disinformation campaigns. In fact, they had trouble finding such accounts. The only account that they found which purchased ads from Russia in any significant amount, meaning more than $10,000 a month, was RT. And that's a legitimate organization, right? It's out there in the open, and it's buying ads for RT.com. So that was all they could find. And they were pressured by the State Department to start looking for more Russians. And the State Department, what it would do, and this is all in those files, is they would collude with journalists in the AFP, in Vice, in NBC, right? NBC News, the so-called disinformation experts. And they would publish a piece that was damning for Facebook, Twitter, Google, using their own quote-unquote research, which claimed that there were Russian disinformation bots out there. And so Twitter was compelled to act or face the wrath of Congress, because Democrats in Congress in particular were keen on seeing results. And given that there were no results, they had to manufacture them. So tens of thousands of users, in fact, over 250,000 users were flagged for removal on Twitter by the State Department. And among them were the Canadian Armed Services, in fact, because they were following two accounts or more that were Russian accounts, Russian diplomatic accounts. And that was enough to flag them as a Russian disinformation bot.
That is fascinating. Like white supremacy, the supply never quite meets the demand when it comes to Russian bots, does it? So
no,
we have journalists, or I guess we have the government asking Twitter to be an investigative tool of the state. So we have this sort of confluence of this private company acting as a tool of the government. I believe there's a term for that. And then you've got, so they're getting pressure from the government. They can't find what the government insists they must find. So journalists now become tools of the state. Again, I think there's a term for that. And they create, the Russia hoax, really.
Yep.
And then Twitter now has to produce evidence of a hoax they know is a hoax and start purging innocent people because of the Red Scare that completely doesn't exist. Am I understanding this?
That is correct. Yeah, it's a feedback loop because the State Department, using whatever analytical tools they have, which is perhaps non-existent because it's probably just some guy in an office, an analyst, providing his opinion on what is a bot, uh, sends it to Twitter. Twitter says no. So he leaks it, right? The State Department leaks it to a journalist, which then publishes that information, claiming that they found evidence of Russian disinformation bots. Now, none of the characters are named, no accounts are named in those reports. But then Twitter gets bad press. And then congressmen call up Twitter saying, hey, why don't you act on it? If you don't act on it, we'll take away your Section 230 free speech rights, your ability to remain immune from liability, right? And that's a big deal. If you're a social media company, you don't want to get sued for what users post on their website. So they're compelled to act. And if they don't act, then they lose their immunity. They're at risk of essentially losing their freedoms. So they feel compelled to act, and then the government's happy. And bit by bit, and this was revealed in the files, it showed how many different government agencies started to get in on it. First, it was the FBI, then it was the State Department, and then literally every state was demanding that they take action against various accounts. And now, while some of these requests are certainly legitimate, like taking down terrorists or actual criminals who are using Twitter to facilitate their crimes, I understand that. But for the most part, when they send them large Excel files, sheets of tens of thousands of users, and tell them to delete it, and they don't, then there's a problem. The government demands immediate action. And so eventually, Twitter became a sort of a hand of censorship. This was, the foundation for the so-called Disinformation Governance Board, where they decided, the government, the DHS, decided to expand its censorship of social media, because it wasn't enough for them to just get rid of Russian disinformation bots. They had to start getting rid of anyone who spoke out against the narrative. Now, fortunately, it was shut down thanks to the efforts of journalist like Jack Posobiec last year. But before it was, they were starting to target people who were critical of the vaccine narrative, the origins of COVID-19. If you said it was from China, that got you censored, right? That was actually part of the State Department, where they started to censor anyone who talked about how the virus may have come from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And now it's anyone's guess as to why they would do that, but that is certainly what happened.
It's quite frightening, actually, how quickly Twitter allowed itself to become the ministry of truth for the American federal government, because that's really what happened here. Because of the First Amendment, the government cannot censor you directly. But it's a neat little trick they did by doing it once removed through a social media company that they were pressuring. And the social media company, being a left-leaning, or at least left-managed company, they were pretty happy to do it because they had the same political enemies. Also, as you were talking there, I thought how quickly they moved to remove innocent people who were alleged to be imaginary Russian bots. But Twitter,
Yep.
for the longest time, had the absolute most evil proliferation of child and revenge porn for a very long time. And the platform said that there's nothing they could do about it. There's no way that they could manage it. But they could, after pressure from journalists and the government, wipe innocent people right off the platform for doing nothing except following a Russian account. Because that's where they wanted to focus their resources. They always had the means to do these things, but they would allow content that was created through child abuse to remain on their site while censoring a grandma who followed a Matryoshka account.
That's right. And this is largely in part due to the FBI itself, because there were so many agents, well, maybe not agents, but analysts working for the FBI who were positioned inside of Twitter. They were in these internal Slack channels. They had an onboarding process. There were so many agents to the point where they had an onboarding process at Twitter. Now we can only imagine how big their presence was at Google, at Facebook, at Instagram, at TikTok. We have no idea, right? Because we don't have those files. But at Twitter was 80 plus people working for the federal government, deciding who to censor. And they were flagging accounts that told jokes. There were celebrities who were even flagged for telling jokes. There was one of the Baldwin brothers. He told a joke about the elections, and he was flagged for disinformation. Now, granted, he's a celebrity, so he, kind of got away with it, and that's fine. But so many other people were banned for telling the same jokes. They would say, "Hey, go and vote on next week instead of on November 8th." Right? They would make jokes like that, and that would get them flagged for disinformation and subsequently terminated from the service. This is happening everywhere, and it still happens on YouTube and on Facebook. If you make jokes like that, you'll still get flagged. You'll still get banned for disinformation, of course. But here's the thing. So you mentioned that there was a lot of child sexual exploitation on the site, and that's true. And what's, I guess maybe not amusing, but what is interesting is that the FBI, instead of focusing its resources on catching people, child pornographers or busting all these people up, all these rings, these pedophile rings, it instead chose to focus all of its energies on Russian disinformation and on election misinformation, whatever you want to call these things. So they had the manpower for it, but they were told from, higher up to only focus on the issues that were important to the political class in the United States, and not to the issues that were actually, victimizing children or women, right? They didn't care about any of that.
Yeah, they were focused on protecting, well, Hillary Clinton and then Joe Biden after her, instead of victimized children. Interesting set of priorities they have here. I wonder, when Elon Musk downsized Twitter, did he just fire all the feds?
Yes,
because it seemed like
yes, he did. He fired Jim
teeming with
Baker.
feds.
Yeah, Jim Baker was one of the lead counsels for Twitter, and he was responsible for much of the censorship. He, if you're not familiar with this guy, he's responsible for the so-called Russian disinformation, Russian collusion hoax. He was the one who brought it to the interest of the FBI way back in Hillary's days. And he ended up working for Twitter for some reason. And, it's anyone's guess as to whether he was planted there by the feds, but he was certainly, amenable to what they wanted. And so when Elon found out that he was still working there, he fired him on the spot. And that was after the drops of one of the Twitter files very recently, like 3 weeks or 2 weeks ago. So, yeah, there were lots of feds there. And it's interesting how, after firing about 4,000 people, Twitter is better than ever. It has, it still manages to function despite all of the doom and gloom that was in the media, saying that Twitter would be dead by the weekend, that it wouldn't be able to handle any of the burdens because all the people expertise were fired. And it turns out that most of the people who got fired were, diversity commissars. That's who they were, right? Their only job is to keep everybody else in line politically, not to actually contribute to the development of Twitter as an app. And now with, Elon in charge, Twitter's faster than ever. It's unveiling or releasing a lot of new features in the coming weeks and months. And we've seen a lot of these features already added. The Spaces, for instance, works a lot better than it used to. So it's really fascinating to see where Twitter will go in the future. He only recently re-enabled political advertising. So now if you're a right-wing organization like Judicial Watch, you can actually buy ads on Twitter, whereas before they didn't let you. So it was very one-sided as to who got to have a voice versus now who has a voice on Twitter.
Yeah, when Elon Musk first took control of Twitter, I was of two minds, and I didn't really care what the outcome was. I thought, okay, if he buys it and makes it better, great. And if he buys it and it ceases to exist in a week from now, also fine. I didn't really know what I was cheering for there. Now, how does this most recent Twitter leak, this Twitter files leak, thread back through some of the previous ones? So what is sort of the overarching theme that is coming together the more Twitter leaks we get?
Okay, so I think we have to look at the first leak, right? The first leak showed how Twitter very slowly became a vehicle for censorship, and how it censored Donald Trump, right? That was what the first Twitter files drops was about, and how they ceased to follow their own terms of services and decided willy-nilly to start banning people. So we had a snapshot of Twitter from say 2019 to 2020, where this happened. But now we're getting to understand the government's involvement in all of the censorship. So Twitter wasn't always like this. It wasn't always a place to censor people's political speech. It was something that happened gradually over a period of time, where at first, Joel Roth, the former head of trust and safety at Twitter, was willing to offer pushback against the federal government when they demanded that he censor things. But eventually, they had come to become subservient to the federal government because they had been giving in bit by bit by bit to the point where they started to feel special. I mean, Twitter was paid $3.5 million to perform these acts of censorship because at one point in the latest drops, they showed how Twitter executives were complaining about how their inbox was completely full, just full of requests from various state and federal government agencies demanding that they censor hundreds of thousands of people. So they couldn't cope with it anymore. So they just had to, they just offloaded it to a bunch of moderators, in places like the Philippines to have them deal with it. And the algorithm was tweaked to make it automated. So, the instant you said anything about election fraud, even if you were having a discussion about it, you got flagged and subsequently removed. And if they wanted to reinstate you, well, it's a crapshoot, right? Maybe you got reinstated, maybe you didn't, and many people were not.
So are we expecting more Twitter leaks?
Yes. Yeah, the next one will be about Fauci and how all of that was covered up.
Oh, I'm sure you're going to be all over that one, aren't you?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, Ian, I have no idea what time it is where you are, but I feel like it's probably either late at night or very, very early in the morning. So I want to thank you for taking the time to come on the show with me today. And I want to thank you for your hard work covering the Twitter files, but everything else that you cover for us here at Rebel News.
That's an excerpt from my show every night. It's called The Ezra Levant Show. That's me, Ezra Levant. You can see the whole thing behind our paywall. Well, there's a lot of goodies behind there. I do a show every weeknight. My friends Sheila Gunn Reid and David Menzies and Nat and Kat have their shows too. You get a ton of content for just $8 a month. There's so much in there you won't find anywhere else. Go to rebelnewsplus.com.